The One Piece manga finally got back on track in 2025 by releasing more chapters than it had in years. But something very strange happened in the story in this year. In 2025, Monkey D. Luffy all but disappeared from his own story. As of the recording of this video, the last time Luffy made an appearance in the One Piece manga was on the 23rd of June 2025, which was now more than 6 months ago. Even before this point, Luffy was mostly absent from the first half of the year, in total appearing in just 11 manga chapters since 2024. This is a record that One Piece has never even come close to achieving in any of its other 27 years of serialization. An example that really brings this home is that in all of the One Piece chapters released in 2025, there is literally just one panel where Luffy lands an attack. This is pretty nuts if we compare it to every past year of the story, where Luffy is essentially an inescapable fixture in the manga, and the story's definitive main character that appears in practically every chapter. Yet in 2025, One Piece is releasing entire volumes, with no sign of Luffy. So, why has One Piece decided to erase its main character? To cut to the chase, there actually isn't any dramatic reason behind Luffy's recent absence. Right after Luffy's last scene in the manga, One Piece has entered what is currently by far its longest flashback ever. This flashback has now not only gone on for more than half a year, but it is still not even done as we enter 2026. The flashback depicts events that happened years before One Piece Chapter 1, so it's perfectly natural that Luffy is not making an appearance. But it's still very bold of the story to for the first time ever abandon its main character for such a long time. Yet, there is a very good reason why this flashback had to be so long. Usually, flashbacks in One Piece just tell the backstory of one character or one island the Straw Hats have recently gotten acquainted with. But while this current Elbaf flashback also started out this way, it actually decided to break this decades-old One Piece tradition and to instead tell a much more ambitious story. Major spoilers ahead, but while the Elbaf flashback started out like any other in the series, by going years into the past to explain the recent history of the Giants, only a couple chapters into this backstory, the flashback was hijacked by another character. A character by the name of Rox D. Sebek, who pretty much is the reason why the One Piece manga has had to put Luffy on the sidelines for more than half a year. Rox for years has been one of the most legendary characters in the lore of One Piece, and someone who was set to rival even Goldie Roger. Yet the manga has always kept his existence in the shadows, where fans did not even know what he truly looked like. Then out of nowhere, in the middle of the Elbaf flashback, Rox was not only finally given a full introduction, but for the next several months, he pretty much became the main character of the story. All of a sudden, Rox became the real focus of the Elbaf arc, where instead of us just learning the backstory of the Giants, One Piece decided to reveal the backstory of an entire legendary pirate generation that had sailed the seas decades before Luffy. Out of nowhere, almost every single great figure we'd ever heard of from the lore of One Piece started appearing in the flesh on the pages of the manga. This was not just Rox, but other legends like Roger, Garp, and the previous Emperors of the Sea for months on end pretty much became the main cast of the series. On top of all of this, the manga decided to actually go all in on this opportunity and made all these figures fight each other by finally revealing the full story of the mysterious God Valley incident. This was not only basically the biggest war we had ever been shown in the story, but this event also revealed some of the most critical information about the lore of the One Piece world. And all of this was happening at an almost weekly pace. So, while the manga did bench Luffy and the Straw Hats for most of the year, this was arguably done in service of the story. Even though none of the Straw Hats were involved, fans were instead without any warning given material the story had been building up for years. But the question still remains, why did One Piece decide to do something like this? When the Elbaf arc first started, I think the majority of fans did not in any way expect this arc about the Giants to be the place where we'd finally hear the story of Rox. From my own experience, most fans thought Elbaf was going to be a traditional adventure arc, simply focusing on the Straw Hats discovering an exotic land and helping the locals with their problems like in past arcs of the story. This also very much was what the arc was like before this flashback. All of the focus in the beginning of Elbaf was just on the Straw Hats interacting with the Giants and learning more about their country. Prior to the flashback itself, Rox was only mentioned just one time in the entire arc. Even though this whole era of pirates was a very important part of the story and something that clearly needed to be told at some point, its placement in Elbaf of all places is genuinely bizarre. Of all the times to tell this part of the story, why did the manga decide to do it in the middle of the flashback about the Giants? Honestly, I personally don't think this was ever something Oda and his team planned to do when Elbaf first started. I think the idea to include the Rock's backstory in this arc was likely a very late decision, but also something the One Piece franchise desperately needed to do. This is because of one very important thing that happened to the series right before this flashback started, which was that One Piece had actually gone through a huge drop in popularity. This all started in late 2024, when the One Piece anime for the first time ever took a 6-month hiatus, starting at the end of the year just as the manga was starting the Elbaf arc. This one event signaled a dip in popularity the series had not seen in years, where for the first time in this century, the franchise had to be entirely carried by the manga, without the assistance of the anime. Yet even after the anime returned later in the spring of 2024, even this did not return One Piece to its former numbers. Part of this was arguably natural. The boom One Piece had enjoyed earlier this decade, from viral moments like the Gear 5 reveal or One Piece live action, was bound to die down eventually. Yet I still think that nobody expected One Piece to hit numbers as low as it did in 2025. I would next like to discuss how the people in charge of the One Piece manga may have reacted to these news. After Oda and his team saw this 2025 decline, they could very well have realized that since the franchise's other big projects, such as One Piece Live Action Season 2, were still months away in 2026, it was actually up to the manga itself to maintain the series' popularity. In other words, Oda may have decided to do more than he had originally planned for the Elbaf arc. This would however be nothing new or unusual for the One Piece manga. While Oda is famous for planning the story well in advance, he has also personally several times admitted that many of the biggest aspects in the story were actually last-minute improvisations that were done simply to spice up the story. This includes some of the most iconic characters in the series, such as the 7 Warlords, or even huge twists like the Galila shipwrights being undercover world government agents, where both of these were ideas Oda included in the manga with almost no prior planning. Oda has also basically admitted that popularity is a driving force behind him making these decisions. For example, another character Oda has admitted he originally had no real plans for is Trafalgar Law. Yet after he saw how well he was received by fans, Oda decided to make Law this hugely important figure in the story. By the way, if you're enjoying this video so far, just a quick request that you click subscribe, because it will essentially just make YouTube recommend you more videos like this. This is still just my speculation, but I genuinely think the inclusion of rocks in this Elbaf flashback was another moment where Oda just decided to improvise. One big indicator of this is the thing I mentioned before, which is how One Piece is famous for setting the story up well in advance, where big storylines and twists in the manga generally happen only after months and years of setup. Yet this was very much not the case with the inclusion of Rock's Tisebek in this arc. As I brought up before, Rox was mentioned literally just once this entire arc before his full introduction. Not only this, but the scene where Rox was brought up also happened very late, just 7 chapters before the Elbaf flashback itself started. But I also feel like the actual flashback storyline involving the giants could very much still have been told even without Rox. Very few things would actually have to be changed for the plot involving Elbaf, Harald and Loki to still work even if Sebek was entirely absent. Another thing that I think indicates that this stuff involving rocks was not originally planned for this arc is that a lot of details about the God Valley incident itself seemed a bit off. I'm hardly the only reader who noticed this, but many of the things that were set up for this event were seemingly glossed over or possibly even altered. For example, we were previously told that Kaido had some strife with Roger involving this incident, yet this was something that this flashback never addressed in any way. Roger himself in the prior story also had this cryptic line about having waited an entire year for something before the God Valley incident, yet this was also something that was never once brought up again. What I personally suspect these scenes mean is that the rivalry between the Rocks Pirates and the Roger Pirates was originally meant to be something different, yet Oda did not have the time to develop this idea, and we instead got the version of God Valley, where Shaggy was used to bring Roger and Garp to the island. Even if this is not the case though, I still think it's safe to say that we only got the abridged version of the God Valley incident. Most fans I've encountered noticed just how fast this event actually went by, where despite the scale, several of the characters and fights involved in this incident were not actually shown, or instead were given just 1 or 2 panels. This would however also be nothing new for the One Piece manga, where for example, the Wano and Egghead arcs had multiple moments like this, where material was genuinely skipped over, and we only later in the anime got to see the full events. Personally, What I think all of this heavily indicates is that Oda and his team genuinely did not have the time to develop the full God Valley incident, but that on top of this, they had to give us this faster version, because the story itself was pushing for the chapters to return to what was going on with the Giants and the Straw Hats. I think the most likely reason why all of this happened, and why God Valley and Rocks were shown in 2025, could very well be that Oda and his team likely saw the big dip in One Piece's popularity and then simply decided to do what they've always done and introduced something exciting to the story they hadn't originally planned. Even if this is just my speculation, what is actually inarguable is that this worked. Rocks' Tisebek finally showing up in the manga was by far the most popular One Piece moment of 2025, with Rocks himself immediately becoming a fan favorite character, and the most discussed thing about the story for months. You can probably see this if you look at your favorite One Piece YouTube channel, where their most popular videos from the second half of 2025 are almost guaranteed to be about Rocks. One point of data that proves just how much Rocks was carrying One Piece in this period was that immediately after his death, and the manga shifting focus back to the Giants, there was once again a noticeable dip in the series' popularity. But as I previously discussed, this is just an old trick One Piece has been using for decades, where Rocks is only one of many characters who were pretty much designed to be these kinds of fan favorites. Now, previously in this video, I mentioned that Luffy was largely also absent from the manga during the first half of 2025. While this was noteworthy, it arguably also was not something the story hadn't done before. Sometimes, the One Piece manga simply shifts focus away from Luffy to give more material to the rest of the cast. This for example happened in Wano Act 3, where after Kaido defeated Luffy for the first time during the raid, the manga for months focused completely on other characters fighting Kaido's forces while Luffy recovered, until Luffy finally returned over a dozen chapters later, and the manga then continued focusing on his fight with Kaido. An older example of this would be something like Skypiea, where Luffy also spent the entire survival game inside Nola, until he finally got out for the climax of the arc to fight Enel, after most of the side characters had already gotten their focus. This was also basically the reason why Luffy was mostly absent for the first half of 2025. This part of the Elbaf arc mostly focused on the God's Knights beginning their operation on the island, and the rest of the Straw Hats and the Giants trying to deal with them. This was essentially just the usual beginning of the arc phase, where the rest of the crew fights the villains, while Luffy is being saved for the big climax at the end. This is also pretty much the answer as to why 2025 was the year with the least amount of Luffy in One Piece history, where this year simply combined the two phases where Luffy is always taken a back seat in the manga, these being the beginning of the arc phase and the flashback phase, with this being an unusually long time without Luffy, only because Elbaf happened to contain the longest flashback in the entire series. I'm however personally convinced that this record of Luffy only appearing in 11 chapters this entire year will actually be topped in the near future. One really simple reason for this is that this Rocks era was still only just the second most built-up period of lore in the story. The biggest is still clearly the events that took place during the Void Century. The Void Century should pretty much overshadow everything we've seen before in the story, in terms of sheer scale, and even Rocks himself in this flashback talks about the figures of this era, completely eclipsing anyone from his generation. Considering how One Piece's flashbacks keep getting bigger and bigger the longer the story goes on, I think it's a guarantee that the eventual Void Century flashback will far outstretch even this Elbaf one we're just about to finish. The second reason why I think the manga will also in the future keep shifting focus away from Luffy is that in the final saga, the story has much more frequently been willing to jump away from the Straw Hats. Since the Egghead arc, we've gotten several chapters where instead of Luffy and company, the manga is suddenly showing events that are taking place in an entirely different corners of the One Piece world. Since One Piece's climax is prophesied to be this massive world war that is going to take place all around the planet, this is also a trend that we will likely keep seeing more and more during this end game. So, because the One Piece manga is constantly more and more willing to pan away from the Straw Hats, even for months on end, before the series is finally over, we might at some point even get an entire year with literally zero Luffy. The fans however do not seem to mind this new direction One Piece is taking. None of 2025's most popular manga moments actually involved Luffy, and I'm pretty sure that the months where we focused entirely on Rocks were basically everyone's favorite time reading the manga all year. So, even though Luffy is the protagonist and the most popular character in this series, One Piece fans are very clearly, first and foremost, invested in the story as a whole, and the manga can evidently survive for significant periods of time, even without its main character. One of the biggest reveals in the Shellback flashback was the legend of David E. Jones, who was not only revealed to be the ancestor of both Rocks and Blackbeard, but in an insane twist, also the possible previous king of the world. This was pretty crazy for a character who was last mentioned in a single page over 2 decades ago, but this still pretty much set Jones up as one of the biggest players of the Void Century. Yet it could be that Jones is being set up for an even greater role in the story. If you're interested, you can click here to check out my video that breaks down why David Jones may still be alive, and that he could be the reason why the world government thinks that they have been at war for the past 800 years. Thank you to all my members for their plunder. I really appreciate everyone who keep watching my videos all the way to the end.